So Ben, is this right? We're not just poised, ready to have all these potential opened here. We're also poised, it could go down one way or it could go down another, which leads to very different futures.
I think the points that Jim has raised are absolutely spot on. I think the potential to do something right is entirely in the hands of not just the scientists, but society as a whole. You have the limitations are the ones that Jim has pointed out. It's transfer of knowledge, make sure that that freedom exists, and yet there is some mechanism for funding the research and the outcome. So the development of most drugs is in the control of pharmaceutical companies, and I would agree that to a certain extent this is almost evil, because they are the only organizations on the planet that have the resource. In a way, that's wrong. We are paying indirect tax through the price of drugs. We should be proud of what's happening in the UK with things like NICE that regulate the price of drugs, that keep it under check. And we should start to think about nationalised models of creating research resource, and some of the ideas that are being explored in the research community could fit in very well with that. So I'm hopeful that something can be developed, but it cannot be down a pure capitalist track, I think. It won't be successful. We've seen that already with drug development over the last 10 years.
Just before I bring in Joyce, you're hopeful, but are you also optimistic? I mean, is this you saying this is the way it should be, but do you also think this is the way it will be?
I think this is going to sound like Schadenfreude, but what's the crisis that has been seen in the pharmaceutical industry the last 5 to 10 years? They are not discovering drugs. They have no new drugs. They are chasing after drugs for, as one of my group will put it, lardy people. The lifestyle drugs are important, but they're not as important as new antibiotics treating diseases that kill many more people in the world. And I think their lack of productivity means that they don't even have a model that makes money anymore. And we need, as a society, to start to take back control of the mechanism that basically cures disease. So I'm hopeful, optimistic.
Okay, drugs for lardy people is still my phrase of the night so far. Joyce?
Yeah, I don't share this big pharma, bad, public sector good kind of dichotomy. I think it's very much more complicated than that. And I actually think we have the pharmaceutical industry we do because of the governance system we've set up to control it. And that's why I'm so obsessed with this point about regulation. If we radically reformed the regulatory system, we would deprive big pharma of its competitive advantage. At the moment, nobody else can play in this game because it's so expensive. So no small company can grow to become even middle-sized because they can't get through all the regulatory hurdles and they can't get the finance. And so big pharma is automatically, and realises that it relies on the regulatory system and kind of supports the regulatory system for that reason. So if you want major change, what you have to do is change the regulatory system. You won't get mega change in the innovation potential unless you develop a regulatory system that's more enabling of small companies.
Yeah, so we shouldn't be going big equals bad, just that big can be bad, and we need to be careful when big is bad.
But it's the way it is because we've made it that way. It's nothing to do with them.
We could start nationalising again.
Great. Shall we, it's not too late to get it written into a manifesto, I think, somewhere.
It is, I'm afraid.
But really, we can't afford to pay $1 billion for a new drug. You know, the public sector just wouldn't pay that. But you have to find it, you have to make it cheaper.
Richard's idea isn't such a bad one. Yeah. We should be clear that the 3 letters that most companies, wherever they are in the world, are most scared of is FDA. The US regulatory authority controls what drugs get through. People don't really care about regulatory authorities in any other country in the world. And so the idea of challenging that, perhaps through nationalisation or other regulatory frameworks, is a fantastic idea. Bring the freedom back.
This is great. We started with synthetic life. We're revolutionising the whole drugs industry. A gentleman there, if we can go to you.
I'll see if I can.
No, we're going to, because we're recording it as well. So it's
just to put it in a good word for free markets, the example you use to paint a pretty exciting picture of the future of your technology is semiconductor world, which has done spectacular things, largely in commercial domain. If you exclude the sort of the ultimate boogeyman of Craig Venter patenting human genome, outside of that, admittedly ethically very tricky thing, what's so wrong about commercial companies pursuing non-human genome related advances in this bioengineering? Because a lot of what you described, it isn't necessarily to do with human genome. It can be, things that Craig Venter is doing now, as I understand, are artificial creatures that process something into oil, some kind of genetically modified or engineered algae for production of petrochemicals. What's so wrong about a market being left to its own devices in this space?
Jim.
I agree. In fact, the analogy that one can make between the microelectronics industry extends to the emergence of the burgeoning software industry. And essentially what we're talking about in terms of modifying genetic systems is to reprogram the the genetic content of organisms. And also, if you go back to the software industry, you there have a viable business model for open source tools, and where open source software, where you have collective support and exchange of resources, is proved to be a very useful model and a very viable model for development of complex systems. And I think one of the things that's driving us is the fact that the technology under our feet is changing, and things are accelerating extremely quickly. And where we'll be in 10 or 20 years' time, clearly it's not today, and every indication is that it's going to be easier technically to do these things, which at the moment are on the horizon, and we can start to grasp them. But in 20 years' time, the kinds of things that will be feasible will be quite profound. They will match our ability, for example, to build a new genome, at least in DNA sequence. We'll actually likely have the potential to encode new functions in that, using the kind of modified elements that Ben's talking about and the kind of construction principles that I talked about. And so with this ability to move much more quickly, that will have arguably a very disruptive effect on the current business models, where you've got large monolithic companies who, you saw the same thing in electronics, where IBM dominated computing hardware. When microprocessors came along, smaller companies could have a much more small footprint and do things more rapidly. And one might expect to see, as the technology changes and things become easier to change, that you'll see that kind of diversity and the ability to undermine existing platforms and to create new added value very quickly.
Ben, just to be clear where we are here, because we've had a lot of kind of what-ifs and in the futures and 20 years' time and hypotheticals and the revolution of the big pharmaceutical industries. What can we do right now with synthetic biology? Where are we at?
I think one of the things we perhaps haven't touched on in extreme detail is actually the phrase synthetic biology means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And what's been so exciting for me was, first of all, to be told that I was a synthetic biologist in the first place. And then over the last few years to meet so many different communities of people who consider themselves to be synthetic biology, who have at heart the same passion for understanding nature and seeing how they can understand its fundamentals and perhaps use them in some form of technology or some form of output. And so there are lots of different things that are going on. Some wonderful examples in using DNA, as we've heard from Jim, as building blocks to construct, make cells perform some fantastic functions. There are some beautiful posters downstairs on some of the really nice examples from a competition that takes place between undergraduate students called the iGEM competition, where they basically train bacteria. They create bacterial species or versions of bacterial species that can do tasks that might be useful that these bugs have never evolved to do. Detect arsenic. There are some examples of scientists in the West Coast in the US who are getting bugs to make anti-malarial drugs, for example. We can start to think about, as I showed, other parts being designed in lots of different ways. Almost there are some of the work that's been done on making proteins and therapeutic proteins. Some parts of that are starting to touch on aspects of synthetic biology and making synthetic proteins. And those are things that could be used as drugs in the near future. So I think we're starting to see that seep through. But there are so many different aspects to it. One aspect that we haven't talked about today in detail are aspects of the science that question the fundamentals of what is living. People are actually building little pockets of grease and putting reactions and molecules inside them to see if these pockets of grease behave like cells.
This is GREASE, not little pockets of, not a little bit of Athens here, or something like that. Fine, just checking.
Sold off.
Yeah.
No, it's no, genuinely, they're taking sort of like the lipids, the fatty molecules that we find in biology, and using them to make an envelope and then say, well, is that all we need for a cell? And that's stimulating debates about what is alive. What is it that how would we recognize it even if we made it from scratch? So I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that synthetic biology is about fundamentals, big questions in life, such as when did chemistry become biology? When did molecules sort of get together at a level which we could describe as being living? So there are so many aspects that are not just outputs, but also exciting questions that I think are relevant to almost everybody.
Okay, well, I think this leads us nicely and neatly. I'll come back to you in a second, but to our next fixed question, so if we can put that one up there.